A decade ago, we started Manthan on September 3rd, and we had Dr. Aditya Mukherjee deliver our first lecture. Shanta inaugurated our Manthan on that day. It's 10 years now, and we are doing the same even today. So, what has changed, and are we the same? Many things have changed in the past decade, and many things are still the same. Firstly, we are still the same team working on this initiative. Manik, Suhim, Ram, Kamlesh, Bashir, Chandana, and Madharav Garu. Only Madharav has a Garu. They are our advisory board, and this advisory board has remained the same. Rarely, if ever, we do meet, but we work beautifully as a team, and I must congratulate ourselves for that. Secondly, we are committed to this idea, as committed to this idea as we were a decade ago. Well, we have achieved some traction. There is still a strong need in this city and in many other cities for platforms such as this. We continue to be wanting to be part of this filling up the gap in our democracy. We also have a desire to hear the best in the world and debate with them, and that desire remains the same as it was a decade ago. We also have the same menu in the last decade, except that today we made a small change. But then if you ask me what has changed, I think what has changed is our audience. And this is what keeps us going. This has changed. While we continue to have many of our old guard coming here, meeting after meeting, and I must thank them for that, both me and Ajay are always surprised that in every meeting, we have some new people coming in and new ideas coming in. And these new people come in almost every debate, and I can see some new faces even today. We have changed the way we reach our audiences. Today, Facebook, Yahoo, our website, to the media, all have helped us to reach people who we could have never imagined that we could have reached them a decade ago. Our constant lookout for quality speakers actually has been transformed from who is available to is he of Manthan quality, and that has changed. The depth of the quality of our speakers has changed, and surely, actually, we have more hits than misses we had in the first 5 years of our work. There have been misses, and I thank you for being patient with us at that time. Finally, what has also changed is our own view of Manthan. We are more than what we set out to be, a platform for intellectual discussions. We are also a small institution, however small we may be, where anything can be done and anything can be discussed if discussed in a civil way. It is this which is as important as the intellectual engagement that makes us better people and a better society. On behalf of the advisory board, I should also here depart from script and thank Ajay for being in sync with us, sync with me. I must tell you here that yesterday we were interviewed by Deccan Chronicle, and he asked me a question as to what is the topic you would like to see more in Manthan. And I said that I would have loved to have more topics on science being discussed. Then he told me that he asked the same question to Ajay, and Ajay said the same thing. And we never discussed about it. So I find it that after 10 years of work, so much of our work gets done even without discussing with each other. And there are still so many items where we disagree. And that is what makes Manthan so special for all of us. It was fun, and I'm sure there will be a lot of learning to be done. Thank you for all for being part of this journey. As usual, our introductions to the speaker will be short, and this time I would like to make it shorter. Uh, Aditya was our first speaker, and he spoke to us on Nehruvian socialism. Last time when I spoke to him and I said, what is the topic? And he said that the idea of Nehru is still relevant, and I would like to speak on that. And that was, for me, a very interesting thought, I think, that all of us should be debating today. We may not have much time for debate, but we'll have always time for Aditya today. Thank you. We will create time for Shanta to speak. 3 minutes. Whatever you can.
It's indeed a great pleasure to be here with such a wonderful Hyderabadi audience. And I think we should congratulate ourselves for being such lovely audience of this great Manthan. We should also thank the advisory group of Manthan for making this an institution in Hyderabad. I call it an institution because it has established itself. They may not meet, but then it happens in a repetitive fashion. An institution is something that is predictable, that we know that it will happen, that there's no stopping of it. Come what may, there will be guests, there will be visitors, there will be speakers, and as Vikram has just said, Manthan certifies its speakers, and that is what they have attained now. It's not the speakers, and I think that's a very great thing that has happened, that you tell your speakers it's your privilege to be here with such privileged audience. Last year, when there was the October 2nd meeting, it was so good to see over 1,000 audience, and you wouldn't believe Professor Aditya Mukherjee that they were so disciplined, you would not get it anywhere in the country. I don't know if Manthan trained the audience or the audience trained Manthan. They sat, they heard, they absorbed, they responded, and it was such a good experience. This debate is so exhilarating. It's such a disciplined people that we Hyderabadis are, and that is what Manthan has made all of us. It is civil, as he says, we respect the ideas, we disagree, but then it does not go beyond a particular liberal democratic framework. And that, I think, is very, very important. Today we are going through some kind of a democracy which most of us are confused. We have our stands on the issue. We see some kind of intolerance that is happening in the country today. Some voices are not allowed to speak. Some rationalism, some kind of steady kind of voice that supports secularism is finding difficult to even express itself. And I think a forum like this, like Manthan, gives a great platform for tolerance, for democracy, for secularism, for socialism, for all the values that the country's nationalists, our heroes, have fought for. And this platform, I'm sure, will strengthen the greatest values of democracy, secularism, and socialism in our country. I'm so happy that Professor Aditya Mukherjee is here, and it's almost like nostalgia that 10 years ago, we sat together in Manthan on a rainy day when the lights were off and under the candle that Professor Aditya Mukherjee spoke to us. It's a different day, but the same spirit. Thank you.
For keeping this public space, for keeping a lively civil society alive at a time, as when Shanta has correctly said, when voices are extinguished, abandoned, and it doesn't even make sufficient news. When public intellectuals are murdered, and it doesn't come onto the front page. Some other kind of murder comes to the front page. that it is not a national debate today that some of our most distinguished academics have been murdered because they are the soft targets. Let me remind you that this is the way fascism has grown in the world. Getting at the intellectuals, shutting down spaces where debate, dispute can occur. So long as institutions like Manthan remain alive, democracy is safe in India. But the day we do not allow this to happen, and mind you, as you said, that Hyderabad is different. I've spoken at similar kind of groups in other parts of the country, including in Delhi, where there are organized groups which shout you down. They actually attend to disrupt functions where alternate voices are being sounded. It is our duty to keep on at it, wherever there is space, to expand that space, and not say that since it is dangerous to do this, let us not do it. Let me come to the subject of my talk is Jawaharlal Nehru and the idea of India. The focus on Jawaharlal Nehru, you will guess, is understandable because these are the days of demonizing Nehru. Especially for the last 1 year. And it is paradoxical that it is on the 175th birth anniversary of Jawaharlal Nehru, his 50th death anniversary, have we chosen to demonize him. Our foreign ministers can go abroad to the Far East, talk about non-aligned movement, talk about Bandung, and not even mention Jawaharlal Nehru's name. Or Panchsheel. That's right. You would repeatedly now be told by one person after another. Of course, there are elected MLAs of a certain party who said that the Godse's bullet was wrongly fired at the Mahatma. It should have been Jawaharlal Nehru. And again, nothing happened. Every time you are told that if only Nehru was not Prime Minister, if only Patel had become Prime Minister, everything would have been so nice. Now, it is not only the lunatic fringe which is saying so. We are witnessing the expansion of the lunatic fringe in our society. It is, in fact, even more than that. Academics who have argued, and I'll just name you two of them because they are well-known names. One is Lord Meghnad Desai, and the other is Professor Tirthankar Roy, who have publicly argued that the good days were the colonial days, and then there was these 40 years, as Desai says, 40 wasted years after independence. That is, the Nehruvian years were wasted years, the fly in the ointment, and then comes the 1991 neoliberal turn, and then again things are very good. Only an economist, and that too, poor economist, could say this. This is so ahistorical. There may be many good things that has happened since 1991, but if India started the 1991 policies in 1950, we would have been a banana republic. And as I said, if you have any sense of history, you would not make this kind of a comment. But then fortunately, Lord Desai is Lord of the British Parliament, and Professor Tirthankar Roy, quite appropriately, is a professor in London School of Economics. He started with Pune, and it was not appropriate because Pune was at one time the fountainhead of Indian nationalism, especially of Indian economic nationalism, and he has ended up there. The idea of India, the term idea of India is not Sunil Khilnani's. The title of his book happens to be so, and many people think that he has created the term. The term idea of India was created by Rabindranath Tagore. And the idea of India that we have is the creation of the national movement from the 19th century onwards. It is the way in which the Indian nation was imagined, which is what the idea of India is. There was no Indian nation since time immemorial. There were empires, there were large regions which came under one or the other empire, But the nation as it is today was something that was imagined in the 19th century, as were all other nation states in other parts of the world. But it is an aspect of our colonized minds that we do not realize that the manner in which the Indian nation was imagined was at that time unique in world history. Colonial people can never accept that they can have a good idea or that they can have a unique or they can make a breakthrough. I mean, I'll give you several examples of this over my talk, that how colonized our minds are. India imagined its nationhood in exactly the opposite way in which it was imagined in Europe. European nations, the French revolutions flattened out France. France was a multilingual country. European nations emerged out of the rise of capitalism and tended to be essentially homogeneous units. Same language, same religion, and so on. By and large, there are exceptions, of course. The Indian nation was imagined as one which will, from its birth, which will celebrate diversity. Diversity was not seen as an obstruction. Diversity was seen as something to be celebrated which was going to help you. The best Telugu poet or the writer or a person like Viresilingam, the best Marathi writer, the best Urdu writer, the best Assamese musician were also the best nationalists. This was not a contradiction. They were complementary to each other. Europe is still today struggling very hard to form a European Union. They cannot even agree on the currency. They cannot agree on what happens to the poorer areas in Europe. I mean, imagine India saying that since the Bimaru states are bringing down our rates of growth, let's drop them. Nobody in their senses has argued that let's drop Bihar or Orissa or whatever. But in Europe, they're saying it all the time. Let's drop Greece, let's drop Spain, let's drop Italy. Let's not take on Turkey because it has too many Muslims. What I'm trying to say is that the manner in which the Indian nation was imagined was unique. It was something that the world can learn from. That is number one. There were 2 or 3 things about the imagination of the Indian nation that I will first outline, and then we'll put Nehru in that and see what has happened to that imagination. The first thing, as I said, was India was to be a democracy. It is often said that India is a democracy because the British ruled over India and we followed the Westminster model. Now, nothing is more absurd than that. India is a democracy because the national movement made democracy their central idea. Democracy and civil liberties. And by democracy, they meant inclusiveness. By democracy, that's why the phrase secular democracy, Nehru would always use it coterminously virtually. There is no democracy without secularism. And there is no secularism without democracy. So democracy was at the center of the Indian imagination. In the 1890s, Tilak is talking about adult franchise. 1890s. Since we all loved going to the United States, let's remind ourselves that in the 1960s, the United States is still debating whether you will allow a black to sit next to you and go to the same classroom or go to the same bathroom. All right? One of the earliest national, global level movements for adult franchise, equal rights to all, were in India. So that was number one. The second was anti-imperialism. And this was again interesting. The Indian nationhood is imagined as anti-imperialists. It's sovereign, independence, and anti-imperialist. Whereas nations emerge in Europe as imperialist countries. France, Germany, England, Japan, not Japan, but all the other European countries all had their colonies. And part of their nationalism was this notion of how big their colonies were. The fact that the sun never set on the British Empire was a very sort of empowering notion for the British nationhood. Now, in the Indian case, Indian nation was going to be not only A, it was going to be independent, and B, it was going to be anti-imperialist. And the third basic idea that the idea of India had was a pro-poor orientation. Not socialist, I'm deliberately choosing the right word, pro-poor. From, again, Dadabhai Naoroji's time or Rana Day's time. Dadabhai Naoroji's first book is Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. The early nationalists framed the whole idea of anti-imperialism on the basis that colonialism causes poverty. So poverty was at the heart of it. Of course, with Gandhiji's coming and with the left coming into the national movement, this idea of the pro-poorness went further, but a consensus on socialism was not there. Those socialist ideas became more and more acceptable to the Indian people by the 1940s. So this is roughly the idea of India. And this idea of India set the parameters in which anybody who came to power in 1947 had to function. Nobody in India in 1947 could say, now that we've become independent and we want to grow quickly, let us become junior partners to the Americans and quickly have growth. And later on we will think of becoming independent. Nobody could say, let us have an authoritarian regime in partnership with an industrial bourgeoisie and have quick growth, and then we will think of democracy. I'm giving you real examples. One is the South Korean example, and the other is the Japanese example. Japan grew at 10% per annum from 1950 to 1970. Japan was the base, American base for Vietnam. Japanese scholars still today say that Indians haven't learned from us. And when I asked them that, when I expressed shock when I was told that you haven't learned, I said, of course we have learned. We all learned from the Japanese. They said, what did you learn? I said, we learned from the Meiji Restoration, the economic nationalism of the Japanese, and how they managed to avoid colonialism, etc. They said, no, what you need to learn is what happened after the Second World War. And what happened after the Second World War was Japan had rapid growth. But they had rapid growth with what they call semi-sovereignty. Till today, Japan is semi-sovereign. India has far greater sovereignty in its foreign policy than Japan has till today. So nobody in India could argue at that time, either the South Korean model. Not only nobody could, if anybody did, they would be in the dustbin of history. So from the left to the right, from the communists to the Birlas and the Tatas, nobody argued either of these models. That is fine. But who was going to carry this idea forward? The idea of India. Who was going to create this new democracy, the new state, the birth of the new state after 200 years of colonialism? The Mahatma, as you know, was murdered shortly after independence, and Patel died in 1950. So basically, the burden of taking forward the idea of India fell on Jawaharlal Nehru's shoulders. And it was just as well. It is not an accident that Mahatma Gandhi had chosen Nehru as his successor, because Nehru quintessentially represented each aspect of these three aspects that I mentioned to you of the idea of India. Now let me quickly see the challenges that India faces from its birth to this idea of India, and we will end with what are the challenges today. At the very birth of the Indian nation, one central idea, the idea of secularism, was challenged in a very big way. Let me take you back briefly to the period 46 to 1950. These were the only comparable thing to that period globally is the Holocaust in Europe, in Germany. 500,000 people were murdered. 6 million refugees came into India. The country was on the boil. This is probably coming. I'll keep it. 1946, the Direct Action Day in Calcutta, where there's a massacre of Muslims and Hindus, massacres, communal massacres. The call was given by Jinnah. And then immediately after that, we have, in October 1946, riots breaking out in Noakhali, where Hindus were being murdered, Noakhali being a remote district of Bengal. And in November 1946, you had the retaliation in Bihar, where for the first time communal riots spread to the rural areas, like wildfire. Now the Hindus were taking revenge on the Muslims and murdering them on a large scale. Now this is the scenario, and of course then there is the partition riots, which I mentioned to you, which made millions of people homeless and millions, hundreds and thousands were dead. Now what was the response at that time? Jawaharlal Nehru clearly saw, and he's written this repeatedly, that the murder of the Mahatma was not just one lone person, misguided man going and shooting the Mahatma. He said that this was a part of a strategy. And he mentions whose strategy it was. He said this was the strategy of the RSS to change the nature of the state. That is, to change the idea of India. And here was the opportunity. Here was the opportunity to make a Hindu India. Because of this, as I said, this immense rise in communal tensions, people's temperaments, and everybody is because of the division of the country, because of the war that happens with Pakistan immediately, the ideal situation to say that we shall create the other side of Pakistan in India, that we will have a Hindu India. But what does the national movement do? And this is one of the glorious things we must remember. When we feel bad about what happened in Gujarat, or what is happening in Muzaffarnagar, or what is happening in Tilak Nagar in Delhi, or wherever, we must remember that much worse, much bigger crisis was faced by this country, and it was handled. How was it handled? Maybe we can learn something from it. At the peak of the negotiations for the transfer of power between 1946 and 47, when Noakhali happens, Gandhi walks out and he goes to Noakhali. So the leadership of the Congress says, Mahatma, what are you doing? How can you be away? These are the biggest negotiations. The transfer of power is going to happen. In fact, the world is going to be looking different once India becomes free. Your presence is required. He said, no, the soul of India, he says, lies in Noakhali. In other words, he understood that what is the point of independence if you've lost the idea of India itself? So he said the soul lies in Noakhali, and I'm going to go there because there communal riots are occurring. And he went there alone. He walked. Every night he slept in a different village, so that he would walk it. And since this area was controlled by the Muslim League and communal forces, there was a lot of hostility. They would throw broken glass on his way. When he would walk, they would throw human refuse on his way, and his answer was to take off his sandals and walk bare feet. The idea was, this was like the crucifixion of the self. He was torturing himself, telling the nation that what you're doing is not right. And when people said, Mahatma, how long will you be there? He said, as long as it takes. So he was there in Noakhali, walking from one village to the other. This is the father of the nation, the biggest leader the country had produced in the 20th century. He stays there for 4 months. 4 months. Which national leader was in Gujarat even for 1 week? Which national leader was in Muzaffarnagar when the riots were happening even for 1 day? Similarly, when Bihar happened, Nehru went with his entire cabinet. Nehru, Patel, Azad, Kriplani, Anugrah Narayan Sinha from Bihar. He took the whole lot and he landed in Bihar, and he said, till we bring these riots under control, we are not going to go. And within a week, the riots were brought under control. The riots which had spread to the rural areas. It's not easy to control those riots. Most of all, Nehru said, he turned the first general election, the only election which we have fought really on this question, he turned the first general election into a referendum. He said, in this election we shall decide whether India will be a counterpart of Pakistan or whether India will be a secular country. He traveled 40,000 miles. He spoke to directly, like I am speaking to you, to 35 million people. 1 out of 10 people he addressed directly. And that was an election to remember. And the result was, all the communal parties put together, the Hindu communal parties, which were at this time the main danger, got only 6% of the votes and only 10 seats. Communalism had become a dirty word. When we grew up as children, nobody boasted of being communal as they do now. Nobody said, "Garv se kaho ki hum RSS hain." You hid yourselves if you were communal. So he had successfully pushed back communalism for several decades, but not, unfortunately, extinguished it, as we are witnessing today. But this was his first victory, as I said, starting off the nation as a secular nation. The second job that he had of building democracy in India, of really taking the idea of India forward, was also done by Nehru in an unbelievable manner. Central to Nehru's idea of democracy was, democracy, he said, is all about dialogue. Central to the idea of democracy is dialogue, difference. People must be allowed to express difference. If there is no difference, then I'll give you two examples. When Nehru became the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, he was the first, he asked his bureaucrats to, especially the second plan, to send it around all over the world for opinions. And bureaucrats being bureaucrats, they sent it to people who they thought were liberal, leftist, Fabian socialists, people who they thought will like the Nehruvian idea. So when the papers came back and Nehru looked at it, he was furious. He said, "You wasted the paper. Obviously these people will agree. Send it to people who will not agree." So it was sent to Milton Friedman, the Chicago school economist. And he did comment on it. I'll give you another example. In 1937, Nehru had already been the the president of the Congress for 2 successive terms, and there was an effort to make him a president for the 3rd time. He found that there was no criticism emerging of this. So he wrote an article, which you can now see, with a pseudonym called Chanakya. He wrote it in a newspaper which used to come out of Calcutta, in which he said he abused himself. He said, Modern Review was the name of the newspaper, Modern Review from Calcutta, in which he said this Nehru has dictatorial tendencies in him. He should not be allowed to win for another time, then he will think that he is indispensable. That article says that in India, Caesarism has no place. There is no place for one big man who solves all problems, however big his chest may be. So he was aware that it's so easy in a country like ours to create these larger than life figures who come with solutions, the Babas. So, and he was criticizing himself. The respect for Parliament, again so contemporary. Nehru would not miss a single sitting of the Parliament if he was in town. He would sit through the entire debates. The cabinet system. If you read the autobiography of C.D. Deshmukh, for example, who was on Nehru's cabinet for about 5 years, he was the finance minister as well. He says that Nehru, if once went to Nehru and said, Nehru ji, aap decide kariye. He said, you are the cabinet minister. You will take the decision. So leave alone he forcing his decision on his cabinet, he insisted that the cabinet took their own decisions. If you look at, now these are easily available, the letters to the chief minister, Nehru used to write almost a weekly or a fortnightly letter to the chief ministers all over the country. And they are like lectures given by an elder statesman to younger people who are coming into politics. He is training the people of India to imbibe the values, the culture, and to create new institutions with which you could take democracy forward. The third major area for India at independence was the issue of sovereignty or independence. It sounds strange to say that at independence the main issue was independence, but that was indeed the case. Political independence meant nothing. When India became independent, nearly 100%, actually 95% of the machines that you required to make any investment had to be imported. Since the statistical method at that time was not highly developed, one way economists at that time calculated how much investment occurred was to just look at how much import of machinery occurred. 95% of even machine tools, your pliers and wrenches, had to be imported. All right? So you had your economic independence. You had your political independence, but you did not have economic independence. This is how neocolonialism came in other parts of the world, in Latin America, in Africa. You had nominally independence, but no real independence. And Nehru was deeply aware of this. And this brings me to this, when Nehru is being demonized, some of the abuse that is put on him is Nehru only thought of the capital goods sector. He never built up the...
He never paid attention to the consumer goods sector, or that he did not pay attention to agriculture, he didn't pay attention to growth, etc., etc. I mean, I'll come to that. But it is so stupid. What Nehru finds at independence, as I just now said, was that we had no economic independence. And what the Nehru-Mahalanobis plan does is to plan a strategy of growth in which we will acquire a certain independence vis-a-vis the rest of the world. From 1945 onwards, 2 years before independence, industrialists after industrialists, as well as senior leaders of the national movement, were going about the world trying to figure out from where will they get machines to build the modern India. How are you going to finance your, how are you going to get the capital goods for your new plans, for the plans of growth? All right? So you are totally dependent on the advanced world at independence. So this strategy of building up the capital goods industry sector in India is what Nehru was all about. In 1947, if you had to import about nearly 100% of the machines, by 1960, you had to import only 43% of the machines to make your investment. And by 1974, you had to import only 9%. That is what gave India its sovereignty. That's what allows India to have an independent foreign policy. It's not the 9-hour speeches that Krishna Menon gave in the United Nations. Diplomatic history does not tell you where independence comes from. The independence came from creating the ability to grow even if the first world refused to help you. And that is why India could lead the non-aligned movement, 100 countries, and cock a snook at the United States when and where they wished. Because you had got yourself the relative autonomy of the advanced first world. And it had to be got in other areas as well. It had to be food self-sufficiency was another major area. And another canard spread against Nehru that he didn't think about agriculture. Again, in 7 years' time, you had the land reforms in place. 7 years, by 1957, the land reforms had occurred and the back of the zamindari system was broken. A 200-year-old system was broken in 7 years' time, and with democracy. People say, why can't we do what South Korea did? Why can't we do what Japan did? But they did it with the General MacArthur's army. Land reforms was done in the Soviet Union at the cost of millions of the rich farmers' heads being rolled. We succeeded in doing the land reforms with democracy, with the courts being jammed with lakhs of cases, with 2 constitutional amendments having to be made to ensure that the land reforms go through. And he brings in, again, it is completely false to say that the Green Revolution strategy is the opposite of what Nehru did. What Nehru did was what enabled the Green Revolution strategy. In fact, the essence of the Green Revolution strategy, including choosing select districts and putting in high-yielding varieties there, was already in place in several districts while Nehru was still alive. And you could not have had the Green Revolution in any case without the land reform. So the result was that from a food shortage country, we had to import about 14 million tons of food immediately after independence. That took care of any effort at a planned effort at industrialization. All the foreign exchange went in food. 4 years before independence, 3 million people had died of hunger in India in 1943. So you're dealing with a very tough situation. And it was necessary to get this economic independence, which Nehru does succeed in doing. Nehru is also able to anticipate the future. And I think this was one of his greatest contributions. At least today's younger generation should remember that. When the Desais and the Roys tell you that if Nehru had not been there, how much better you would have done. See, since 1991, what quick growth we've had. Now, if Nehru had not been there, then we would have had 9% rate of growth from 1950, and you would have been very, very rich indeed. Now, that's not true. The fact that today we are anywhere in the picture of the information revolution is because of what happened in the first plan itself. If you look at the first plan, you would be amazed. The first plan doesn't talk about big steel mills and bridges and dams. The first plan, what will shock you, is talking essentially about creating institutions, especially scientific and technical institutions. All your IITs, your National Physical Laboratories, Chemical Laboratories, Bhabha Atomic Research Center, just name it. Even your Sahitya, Lalit Kala Academies and Sahitya Academies, any institution that you could think of were created in that period. And we are the product of that. Because this was an area which was left barren deliberately by colonialism. So enormous amount of input had to be put into the science and technology area, which Nehru did. He anticipated, as I said, the knowledge revolution, the post-industrial world. And India is able, not fully, but to whatever extent we are able to exploit. The reason why your service sector grows is the dynamo of your growth, is because you are participating in this knowledge revolution. And it is largely because of Nehru's intervention, and we should not forget that. It is not despite Nehru, but it is because of Nehru that we are able now to participate in the global revolution. When the Desais and all say that the first 40 years were wasted, those 40 years were necessary to first unstructure colonialism so that India could participate in the global framework with advantage to itself. It is not an accident that all third world countries had to do that. China also needed its 30, 40 years. It opened up to the world only in 78. India opened up in 1991. You needed your Maos, you needed your Nehrus, you needed your Sukarnos, you needed your Nasers. If you didn't have that, you became neo-colonies. Of course, it is another matter that once we created this scientific manpower, I hesitate to speak in the presence of such distinguished scholars here like Professor Bhargava, Professor Shanta, and so many others. But unfortunately, as this first flush of Indian scientists born out of the tears and blood of the Indian people began to emerge in the 1960s, started entire batches of IITs and AIMS's graduates wanting to move abroad. Entire batches. And because we had told ourselves that colonialism only means exporting of raw materials and importing of capital goods, nothing else is colonialism, we thought this is very good. We are so proud that we are sending everybody abroad. I always tell the story of this IIT scientist who I happened to chat with once, and after a brief while he said, Professor Mukherjee, I'm so happy today, I'm delighted. So I thought maybe some student of his has made a discovery or some big breakthrough. He says, Professor Mukherjee, my whole class has gone to the US. What a sick society, I almost fainted. What a sick society where a teacher thinks that his greatest achievement is कि सारों को भगा दिया विदेश. And all of us, you and us, are product of exactly the opposite. Mridula, I, Shanta, our teacher, Professor Bipin Chandra, we traveled all over the country. We started from Kasargod in North Kerala and went district by district right to the edge of the subcontinent and came up on the eastern coast right up to Kakinada, etc. We did about 3,000 hours of interview talking to ordinary people. Dalits, women, people who do not get voice, people who do not enter the archives, people who do not enter the newspapers. We wanted to know what made them tick. How did the national movement happen? And as again, I always like saying that unlike the subaltern scholars, we actually tried to give voice to people by trying and talking to them, being with them. The subaltern school scholars tried to give voice to our people from 10,000 kilometers away. That is the minimum condition. They all situate themselves either in the first world and as far as possible as as far as possible, the better. You know, Chicago, Australia, at least that far. Don't go to even Japan. There are no subaltern scholars in Japan. So, and one of the conclusions that we came to when we asked everybody, for example, one question we would ask is, what enabled you, a woman in a conservative family in a village, what enabled you to come out on the streets? What made the poor person come into politics? Going into politics those days didn't mean getting some favors. Going into politics didn't mean you'll get contracts. As colonial scholars think, Judith Brown writes a whole book about Gandhi and his subcontractors. That was not what happened. Going into politics then meant suffering, losing your cattle, losing your family, being in jail. So we asked them, what made you do so? Almost to the last person, the answer was, my school teacher said, Desh ke liye kuch karo. Or my mother said, not the father so much. The mother and the school teacher. We are the product of the intelligentsia of the 19th century and early 20th century. And here we are, who are clapping when we turn the face of our children away from the country altogether. And don't tell me that there is a trickle back. Last year's figures, December 2014, 95% of Indians who go to the United States to do degrees, to get their PhDs in the sciences, one or the other aspects of the sciences, including medicine and engineering, they stay back. 95% stay back. In 1960, 14% of American PhDs were non-Americans. Today, 40%. 40% of American PhDs are non-Americans. So while America rakes it in, we happily give it away. And don't even think that this is colonial. Because nobody is forcing you away. We are actually edging each other out, each one out to go out, isn't it? So this is not indentured labor. This is voluntary migration. And this voluntary migration happens because we have colonized, poisoned our minds. In the sciences, since Professor Bhargava is here, whenever I see a very challenging person bigger than me, I like to say something which might irritate them. Or so I might say this, even about science. You know, this notion, when we talk to scientists who go to the West and said, "Bhai, why are you here?" To the last man, they'll tell you, science is universal. In India, there are these problems, chemical bhi theek nahi milta, adulterated, ye, wo, etc. How can you do science here? So over there, science, you can do better science, and science is universal, so let me do it wherever it is done best. So two of the top scientists of India, one all of you know of, George Sudarshan, who every time the physics Nobel doesn't go to him, people say, why is it racism or whatnot? And the other is Swadesh Mahajan. They wrote a paper, a well-known paper, in which they studied the Indian scientists in the US. And they said that their Indian scientists are among the first. You know, I like talking about the United States in Hyderabad. You can, for understandable reasons, you know, there's an umbilical cord here, isn't it? I mean, Shanta put me at the Hyderabad club, and, you know, at dinner and breakfast, the only conversation I heard was the various foreign countries that their kids were, you know, and what they were doing, who was sending what, and who was, etc., etc. So, of course, we are, and this is a positive thing also, I'm sure. But so he said, the paper says that the Indian scientists are the first to get their PhDs. They're very well. They even are very quickly picked up as postdocs because they work very, very hard. And then when it comes to tenure, problems begin to happen, but they still make it. They even become professors, bulk of them. But when you look at breakthroughs, you hang on to one, Hargobind Khurana. You know, here you are taking away the cream of your society for the last half a century. You have to be some kind of a genius even to get into an IIT. And you are then taking the best of those for half a century, but no breakthroughs. Then they came to the conclusion that the Indian science, they said that science is also cannot be delinked from their people. Science is not also universal. They said that science, Indian scientists, they use this imagery, are like members of an ensemble where the conductor of the orchestra is the American science establishment. There is no Indian science establishment. Indian scientist does not stay back and create an Indian science establishment as Professor Bhargava did, as ISRO does. And ISRO doesn't do it. I spoke to the ISRO chief the other day, and he said, and I said, what about brain drain? He said, doesn't matter, doesn't bother us. Because brain drain happens from these top universities, you know, the St. Stephen's colleges and the IITs. We are based on the mufassils and the small towns and the people of this country. There's enough talent here. In other words, it can be done only if you had the challenge. Some of the world's biggest breakthroughs you are able to make. In fact, as you know, I mean, even the boson breakthrough was made by Bose from Dhaka. I mean, you didn't have to go to some very fancy laboratory to do that. So, let us be very clear that here was where Nehru played a very big role, creating independent establishments of your own. We are a product of that. The Jawaharlal Nehru University was set up with this notion. A 5,000-year-old civilization, but no school of thought. You talk of history, you say Cambridge School. You talk of economics, you say Chicago School. What about an Indian school? There was once a Delhi school, which is only Delhi school because it is based in Delhi. Because the top economist of the Delhi school, from the left was Amartya Sen, who sits in the United States, and from the right was Jagdish Bhagwati, who also sits in the United States. So where is the Delhi school of thought? Why don't we have an independent school of thought? So Jawaharlal Nehru University was started with this idea that the best of this country will not, our batch, nobody even applied to go abroad. We said we will do our PhDs here, we will only go to teach, we will interact, we all travel, but this is going to, we have to create our own institutions. Our teachers, some of the best in the world, refused to publish in foreign journals. They said, if we do not publish in our own journals, how will you make an Indian journal which is international class? But then, it requires an effort, and it requires not one Nehru, but several Nehrus. And here we are, destroying whatever the legacy of Nehru was. Here we are telling ourselves, minister after minister, across governments, that what we need is to learn from the United States how to do education. Learn from their community colleges. Bring in foreign universities. Can you imagine? The example that was set to the whole third world, that how you can have an independent science, how you can have an independent social science, how you can, in a poor country, create an independent voice. When Nehru created this independent voice, when Japan was lying down in front of the United States, Nehru would oppose the Korean War, he would oppose the Vietnam War. And when in the global community everybody said, you guys are beggars, you go about with a begging bowl, who are you to speak like this? So Nehru's answer was very instructive. He said, we may be poor, but who has told you that the poor cannot have a voice? So here was a man who gave dignity to the poor, to dignity to our people. And we are busy destroying that. The last issue, my time is running out, was equity. Nehru gave the word socialism a different meaning altogether. Socialism, as you know, has become a dirty word today. Everything bad that happens, you say, this is because of the socialistic policies that we had and so on and so forth. But this is not the way it was. Nehru rescued socialism from Stalinism. He was one of the first in the world, along with Antonio Gramsci, who everybody in India likes to praise. Because, kam se kam Angrez nahi tha, but white skin to tha na, he was an Italian Marxist. So Gramsci. But Nehru is described as this pink person, not red. Nehru says the same things as Gramsci does at the same time. That is, how do you have socialism in a democratic situation? That was Gramsci's main problem. How do you make a transformation in a democratic situation? And Nehru was one of the first to break out of Stalinism and say there is no such thing as dictatorship of the proletariat. Socialism must be socialism with democracy. Socialism must be socialism of 90%. You have to carry everybody, including your opponent. That would be the socialism that we want. And the result was, from film stars like Raj Kapoor to sitarists like Ravi Shankar, to the poet, to the beggar, to the diplomat, to the civil servant, everybody was happily socialist and talked about socialism without thinking that they have committed some crime. In other words, popularizing the idea of socialism probably nobody had a bigger role than Nehru in that. And he was able to do that by humanizing it, by giving it a flavor, a color, an intellectual dynamism that any breakthrough would require. So much so that even the BJP, when it was formed in 1980, check it out in the newspapers, you won't believe it anymore. They said, we are a Gandhian socialist party. The successors of the murderer of Mahatma call themselves Gandhian and they call themselves socialist. Because the idea of socialism, the idea that Gandhiji represented was the idea of India had gone deep down into the minds of the Indian people. And this is something we must remember, that what distinguishes India from China or many other parts of the world, two things distinguish. A, no Indian ever talks of having made a revolution. Everybody talks about the Chinese revolution, Russian revolution, Cuban revolution, Albanian revolution. I mean, revolution in countries that you cannot even place on a map. But India did not have a revolution. The transformation that occurred in 1947 is not a revolution because there was no violence. So we've defined revolution in a very peculiar kind of way. So that is one thing which distinguishes us. The other thing which distinguishes India and is far more important than any revolutions, so-called revolutions, is that the Indian transformation occurred through a movement which was prolonged and which was mass-based. Our national movement was not a coup. It was not a capture of power. It was not a revolutionary army which went and captured power. It was not some guerrillas who went and captured power and forget about the rest of the people like the Russian Revolution. All of those revolutions ended up in civil wars because somebody captured power, the people were not with it. India's was a nearly 100-year-long movement. A 100-year-long movement which was the mass movement, the greatest mass movement in world history. Write it down in your heads before we begin to feel that somewhat ashamed for being an Indian. The biggest mass movement in world history, which meant that the ideas of the movement went deep down into the minds of our people. Even when the intelligentsia falters, even when the politician sells himself, the people don't accept it. The people did not accept Indira Gandhi when she declared emergency. 16 years the Prime Minister. We were in Andhra Pradesh at that time when she was assassinated. And we were in villages where they did not cook when she was assassinated. And the poor people said, Hamari maa mar gayi. And the landlord said, Teri maa mar gayi. Right? She was very popular. Shanta, you must be remembering that at that time. Yet, she meddled with democracy, one of the central ideas of the national movement, and the people booted her out. Till she made amends for it. You can't do that. You can't do in India what you did in China. This Deng, what I say, you can't do a Deng on Mao. Suddenly Mao dies, Deng comes to power and he says, very famous statement of Deng, no Indian can ever make it. Deng said, I don't care what the color of the cat is, so long as it catches mice. So you have to catch mice. Catching mice means growth. So how does it matter how do we do growth? So their enemy for decades, United States now becomes their biggest friend. And they pursue capitalism in a manner which would even put the Americans to shame at some time. Using prison labor, using all kinds of undemocratic methods. Till today, an average Chinese citizen cannot even go from one city to the other because his pass is confiscated by the employer. You are not even a citizen the moment your pass is gone. Alright? Now you can't do that in India. That's why it took us a long time to shift our economic strategy. You have to carry your people with it. But provided we keep the people's space alive. That is why the Manthan is so important. This space has to be kept alive. The people have to speak up. I'll end with just one other example which makes me proud. Because, we all feel very bad at what is happening around us. But let us also feel proud about what is possible. The bad is obvious. The threat to secularism has reached its peak. But look at the other side. We have a party which believes in Hindutva. Which believes that India is a Hindu Rashtra, and we still don't have a Hindu Rashtra. How is it? They control the central government. They're not only in power in Gujarat, they're in power in the center. It's because the people haven't accepted this idea. It's the legacy of our national movement. It is this legacy which we have to keep alive. But this is not permanent. Do not for a moment think that this will always be there. It is an advantage we have, but it is not a permanent gift. Do remember that the land of the Mahatma could become the killing grounds of the Muslims. Did become. And one of the most, I mean, there is still resistance there, but still, if even Atal Bihari Vajpayee said his head came down in shame at what happened in Gujarat. So it is not that the dangers are not there. The dangers to the scientific temper, about which Professor Bhargava has, I have heard him 100 times on this. This is one of the central thing about Nehru. Here you have a prime minister speaking to a group of doctors in Bombay. Some doctors you could recognize, they are so famous. And he tells them that in ancient India, we knew plastic surgery. Otherwise, how did Ganesha's head come on top of a human being? He tells them in ancient India, we knew all about stem cells. Otherwise, how did the mother of the Kauravas have 100 children? He tells you in great detail what happened. He says Kaurava's mother could not conceive, so she had an abortion. So they took this lump of flesh, cut it into 100 pieces, put it in cold ghee, and for 2 years they kept it in that cold ghee, and they did some mantras, and out came the 100 Kauravas, Prime Minister of your country. No doctor walked out, leave alone protest. As I like to say, that we need to regrow our spine. Otherwise we cannot blame our leaders. If our people do not object to this horrendous mixing up of mythology with science and history, and done by responsible people, as I said, some lunatic does it, who cares? But the person you choose as your representative should not be allowed to get away with tarnishing the image of, as I said, this great nation with a great heritage. And I'll end by saying this, that you all know about Cardozo. Cardozo was the president of Brazil. He brought Brazil into democracy, the transition from military dictatorship. And he also brought Brazil into the globalization process. And he visited India in the late 1990s, and he met a set of intellectuals. I was one of them, fortunate to be one of them. And he was harangued by many intellectuals, especially from the left, who said that Cardozo, let me share with you, was a Marxist. He was a left dependency thinker. Like Manmohan Singh, he was a professor, but unlike Manmohan Singh, he was on the left. Manmohan Singh, as you know, was on the right. So these people were telling Cardozo that how is it that you, like as if he was a renegade, how could you take Brazil into the globalization process? Because globalization to these people's mind was like selling out to the Washington consensus. So they said, how could you do this? So Cardozo thought about it, and his answer was very, very, very instructive. We have used it in our book. He said, you're asking me the wrong question. The question cannot be whether to globalize or not. He said, gone are the days of the Iron Curtain and the Bamboo Curtain. If you do not participate in the globalization process today, you will become a Myanmar. So that option is not there. The question you should ask is, how do we globalize? Do we globalize with our sovereignty intact, or do we disappear into the armpit of the United States? Do we globalize completely ignoring the poor, or do we globalize creating a safety net for the poor? That is the question you should be asking. And then he said, and you should also remember that you have an advantage in India over Brazil in this process of globalization. So again, being what we are, cannot believe that anything can be right about us. He said, how can it be, sir? What advantage can we have? He said, your advantage is that you have 100-year-old tradition of resistance. And he started with Gandhi. That whatever, that the tradition of resisting injustice in whatever form it takes. You have that tradition, which was taken forward, then he says, by Nehru and by the communists and others. But the fact that we've had this tradition of resistance is something that today we must remember. When we falter from this path that was given to us, that was the legacy of the generations which created modern India, the generations of which we are the beneficiaries of. If that legacy is to be maintained, then the other side of maintaining that legacy is continuous resistance. And I might end by saying that it is people that I have, who are here, many of them are who are here, who have maintained that kind of resistance, each on their own field. And one of the best examples that one can think of is Professor Shanta Sinha, maintaining resistance on an issue which is central. In what way? When I was talking of equity, this is probably our biggest failure since independence. We have a BJP in power, but we are still not a Hindu Rashtra, so we haven't completely failed in that ground. We are still an independent country. We have not become any junior partner to anybody, so there is still success there. But as far as equity is concerned, with 100 times more resources than available at Nehru's times, we have created an inequity which is, the only word for it is to call it obscene. Obscene levels of inequity. 1 out of 3 children do not go to school in this country. 1 out of 3. And it is movements like Shanta's which have again we don't recognize it. She changes the way in which the world looks at child labor. The definition of the ILO is changed because of the work that is done in Rangareddy district, where they said child labor is any child out of school. But here we are, not seeing this successful model right under our noses. We are not able to scale it up to the rest of our country. Why? Because our faces are turned somewhere else. We are looking for a model that Hillary Clinton will tell you about. Not the models that we have generated, not the successes. Many efforts have been made. That let us look at the successes. And so many of them, successes in Himachal, successes in Kerala, successes in Andhra Pradesh, but we are not looking at that. Gandhiji, I will end with this. Gandhiji used to say, his one advice to everybody was that when you take the next decision, if you have a doubt, think of the poorest face that you ever seen and think that will this step benefit him in any way or not. In other words, his basic mantra was, turn your face towards the poor. Today, the lesson, the first thing we have to do is, as a teacher I am telling you of one of the premier universities of this country, my first job is to turn my students' faces away from the West towards at least your own country. Then will come the poor. The poor comes only after your nation. If the nation doesn't exist, where is the poor of that nation? So the idea of India in many ways is at threat. And the chief culprit, if I may say, is the intelligentsia. The idea of India remains in the poor still. The idea of secularism remains among the uneducated. The idea of empathy, many of the basic values of idea of India remain there. What has happened is that the intelligentsia has abdicated responsibility. The intelligentsia which made the modern India, which created the idea of India, has now abdicated responsibility. Everyone that I know of my class, or the middle class, in Delhi at least, is plotting and planning how they can send their child abroad, if not themselves. If that is the central goal, then it would be very difficult. But I'm not saying this is the entire intelligentsia. Fortunately, as I said in earlier, the intelligentsia does not probably live in the metropolises. Probably it will emerge from the small towns and other areas. Thank you very much.